Well, good morning, Living Stones. Obviously, I'm not with you, and that's because I'm at home quarantining. You might just think this is my sexy voice. It's not. It's COVID for the second time. I've been pretty sick all week long, and I've been testing negative all week long, and then Saturday afternoon tested positive, unfortunately. So what you're getting is you're getting sexy voice, Pastor Mark, from my living room. The Bible says that preachers preach in season or out of season, in COVID or not with COVID, and so that's where I'm at this morning, just preaching. And I'm not feeling the greatest, I'm not feeling the hottest, but the good thing it's not based upon me, it's on the Word of God. And I just want to take a couple minutes with you this morning, open up the Bible. We are in this series, Amazed by Jesus, and in whatever season we're in, we're called to be amazed by Jesus. I'm in this moment, I'm in this season. I got my family in the front row here, no back row Baptists in this house, and they're here. And you know what? We're in quarantine, we're in our house, we're in this season, and we're to be amazed with Jesus. And it doesn't matter why, and it doesn't matter our circumstances. And so Mark has been setting out before us a small little book about Jesus that's just full. It's short segments, but they're very, very full. They're very, very deep. And we're going to look at a text today that only happens in the book of Mark. You won't find it in any of the other Gospels. And it is strange, it's interesting, and it's deep, and it's rich. We get to talk about what does trusting Jesus look like? You know, there's a difference between believing in someone and trusting someone. You're like, I believe in you, right? Like I've always kind of hoped for the day that on a plane, both the pilots would eat the fish and they'd be incapacitated. And then they would have to come out and say, is there anybody here that can land the plane? And I have a small amount of experience in flying little Cessnas and a large amount of experience in high school with flight simulators. So I feel really equipped. And so I'd be the first one to pop up my hand. That's a dream. If there's bucket list, that's on my bucket list. Land a plane after the pilots get sick. Now you might say, I believe in you, Pastor Mark. I think you can do that. And yet, how many of you would actually want to be on the plane so that I could do that? Probably none of you. None of you would want to be on the plane. Maybe a couple of you that are crazy. Most of you would not want to be on the plane. Why? You believe in me, but you don't necessarily trust me. If someone said, I'm going to swim across Lake Tahoe, you might believe in them. Now, if they said, get on my back, you're not going to trust them. That's the big difference. And the Bible calls us to risk everything for Jesus. Everything. Risk it all. Give it all away. In one of the other Gospels, there's a parable that Jesus says, here's what the kingdom of God is like. Here's what Jesus is like. He's like a treasure that's buried in a field, and you stumble across this treasure in a field, but you don't own a field. And so then you go and you sell everything you have, everything, so that you can buy this field, which seems crazy because people are like, that's just a sagebrush-filled field. And you buy it only to find that you dig up and that treasure is now yours. You would sell everything for the sake of that treasure. That's trust. That's not just believing that Jesus exists. That's not just believing that Jesus can do good things. That is trusting Jesus with everything. And the Bible calls us to risk everything for Christ. And here's the thing, though. That doesn't come overnight. Maybe some of us have had an incredible conversion experience, or we've met Jesus and everything changed like Paul in one moment. But Paul struggled with weakness. Paul had a thorn in his flesh. Paul, it wasn't perfect. Paul wasn't perfect by any means, even though he wrote most of the New Testament. You and I, we might have super clear moments of giving it all to Jesus, and then sometimes we struggle. But trusting Jesus, going from just believing in him to actually selling everything for his sake, or to risk everything for his sake. Those are two different things. And this passage moves us from believing in Jesus to trusting in Jesus. And it starts in 31, Mark chapter 7, as we've already read together. says this, "Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went to Sidon, to the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis." So this is just a small little transition sentence that helps us see what's going on with Jesus. Last week, Jesus met with the Syrophoenician woman, and we heard that compelling, heart-wrenching, loving story of Jesus and how he expressed grace to a woman in a culture that wouldn't have received grace. And now we've gone from Tyre to Sidon, which are somewhat of the same region, but quite a ways walk between them. And we get to Sidon. Now, Sidon was a wealthy, knowledgeable city. Like if you think, like New York City is a city that we typically think of that's like highly intellectual, highly wealthy. That would be the kind of city that Sidon was. Highly wealthy, highly intellectual. They trusted their money. They trusted their knowledge. And here Jesus is entering that kind of place. And it's beside Decapolis. Now, we've seen Decapolis before. We saw Decapolis a few chapters ago when Jesus healed the demonized man after crossing the sea, arriving to the tombs. And that man was put into his right mind and then wanted to go with Jesus, but Jesus said no. And so Jesus said, no, go back to your home and tell them all the things that I've done, right? Go be a missionary. Go talk about Jesus. It's better that you go back home than you travel with me. His home was Decapolis. So Decapolis was a Gentile area. It had a large Jewish population, highly industrious, pretty large area. And it was next to the city Sidon. And so it embodies that wealth and that intellectualism and that industrial way of thinking. And so that's where Jesus is. Now, it's probably not by chance that a lot of this story happens because Jesus healed the demonized man and sent him back to Decapolis. And then he was talking about Jesus. So now when Jesus is showing up in the area of the Decapolis, obviously people are anxious to see him. People want to meet him. And look what happens in verse 32. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. And they begged him to lay his hand on them. So we're just going to start. Look at this they. I just want to start with the they. Notice it doesn't give any definition of who these people are. It's the infamous they, the government they, right? They out there. There's just a group of people. They have no name. The point is not to know their name, but the point is to see how Jesus is encountering this they. And we're going to look at it. You're just going to see the motivations of this they. So they brought him, this group of people, brought this man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. Now, here's the thing. With these particular words, deaf, but in connection with speech impediment, probably meant that he wasn't born deaf. He wasn't always deaf. Because the speech impediment is not just that he couldn't speak, as if you never were able to hear, you would not have the ability to speak. You can make sounds, obviously, but you wouldn't be able to speak. This is a speech impediment. Something is hanging up his words in his mouth and his tongue, as well as he's deaf. And so it's likely that somewhere, some point, maybe as a kid, maybe older, he got into an accident, had an accident, and that accident now stops him from being able to hear, but it also keeps him from being able to speak clearly. So because he would have been able to speak, so it's a speech impediment. So it seems like this is an accident of some sort. He wasn't born this way, right? And they are coming to Jesus. Now, here's what Mark does really fascinating in this really strange text. Why do they bring him? Now, we might say, well, they brought him because they love this guy. And that might be true. But notice that Mark doesn't give us any idea of why they bring him. There's two clues here. Begging, and then it says, what were they begging for? To lay his hands on him. They wanted Jesus to lay his hands on the man. These are the only two cues we have that speak to any of their motivation. Now, if the man was not originally deaf but became deaf, and then now isn't able to speak, maybe it was love, or maybe it was frustration because this man can't speak and it's a constant frustration. And these men who brought him to speak, Maybe they want this to be taken care of, so they're no longer frustrated by it. Here's the thing is we don't really know. What we know is he was needy. And these guys bring him to Jesus because he's needy, he's weak, he needs help. So they bring him to Jesus. But Mark literally gives us no clue. Here's another clue of their motivation. Laying hands on him is not the same as healing him. You'll see in other parts of the book of Mark, it'll say, and the crowd came to him and they wanted Jesus to heal him. Or Jesus was going around healing and then people came, right? Like there's those kind of setups here. There's no setup. We don't see anything in the context where Jesus was already healing to give an idea that what they wanted was healing. This language, laying on hands, is actually language that could be associated with a blessing of a rabbi. Like maybe this man thought that what had happened to him was because God was angry or God was frustrated. And they wanted a prayer of blessing, something to set God right. That's a possibility. We just don't know. Maybe they wanted the miracle. Maybe they didn't. But here's the difference. If you go to the other they passage, which is when they come and bring the paralyzed man through the roof, Jesus says, seeing their faith, and then he moves. Here, there's nothing. Jesus doesn't acknowledge their faith. In fact, if the laying on hands is just a mere blessing, it means they didn't really have pure faith. They didn't have a total understanding of who Jesus was. He was needy. And so here's what we can pull out of here. We don't know why they brought the man, but we know that their faith wasn't perfect. And we can imagine that there's multiple kinds of motivations that would have led somebody to bring this man to Jesus. The point is we come to Jesus needy, but we need to remember that we come to Jesus with our needs, with all kinds of various motives, most of which are not pure. Sometimes we have very pure motives. Sometimes we don't have very pure motives when we come to Jesus. Moving from belief into trust is remembering that anytime we come to Jesus, we're coming to Jesus as needy, but sometimes those needs that we want Christ or we want God to meet are needs that are actually are coming from impure motivations, even in our own heart. So when we come to Jesus, we're never coming purely. We're coming because we're needy, but even in our neediness, we're coming with all kinds of motivations. And Mark gives us no idea of what those motivations were for these guys. And so their motivations were all over the place. In some sense, it was an imperfect faith. In some sense, it was a small faith. In some sense, it could have been that they were just frustrated by how this guy communicated and they wanted it fixed because it was frustrating to them. We don't know. But look at what 33 comes. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears and spitting, touched his tongue, and looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephathath, that is, be open. So here's what's amazing. The Bible constantly reminds us that it's never the pure motivations of our heart that causes Jesus to move. It's not about what we can bring. That's the great thing about the vagueness of their motivations here, the vagueness of their faith, if it was even there, the vagueness of what they wanted Jesus to do. It also will show us how surprised they are by what Jesus does. It shows us a little of really their motivations that they had in their understanding of who Christ is. So no matter how dim their understanding of Jesus was, it is never our purity that causes Jesus to move. It is Jesus' strange compassion. And so there's no reason here. They beg him, they come to him, they have kind of mixed motivations, and what does Jesus do? Jesus meets them with a strange compassion. And when I mean strange compassion, might have to edit that out. We mean, look at this passage. Jesus does some weird things in this passage. Like if you read this passage, you should walk away with some Questions that go, what in the world is happening and why? Let's just deal with some of the strange ways in which Jesus has compassion on this man. First, he takes him aside. Why? So the crowd's there, the they is there, the disciples are there, everybody's there. And Jesus says, hey, let's come over here, and maybe holds the man's hand or allows the man to hold Jesus' arm, walks him away from all the chaos, just pulls him out of the situation. In fact, there's only one other miracle in which that happens, which is in the next chapter, chapter 8, verse 32. It's the only other place in which Jesus pulls somebody aside in order to serve them like this. That's strange. Why? The next thing you'll see is what? He gives him a wet wheelie, right? He puts his fingers into his ear. He spits on his hand. He touches his tongue. Okay. Pulls it out of his mouth. These are not COVID days, right? These are definitely not COVID days. And some scholars say that Jesus spit on his fingers when he touched his ears. Some say, like in this order, it came afterwards. Either way. So we have some weird things here. Jesus touches the man's ears. Jesus holds the man's tongue. Jesus spits on his fingers. What is going on? Well, if I were to ask you this question, if I couldn't hear and I couldn't communicate to you, how would you communicate to me what you were going to do? How would Jesus communicate to this man his kindness? How would Jesus communicate to this man that he was going to heal his ears and heal his tongue if he wouldn't have touched it or grabbed it? And so Jesus is meeting this man where he's at. He pulls him aside out of the chaos of the scene and all the people trying to get in. And also, if you can't hear and you have disabilities, you're hyper aware of what might be happening around you and your safety. And so Jesus takes him to the side. Why? So Jesus could just focus on him, and he can focus on Christ. So Jesus can look him in the eyes and be intimate and vulnerable and touch his ears and touch his tongue to say, I'm going to do something about this, and I'm going to do something about this. And so Jesus communicating with a man where he's at. Not amazing? And that's, God approaches us and just communicates with us. And we come in here today with all kinds of misunderstandings and misperceptions about who Jesus is. And yet this morning, he's going to communicate to you in a way you can receive. And yet other things might go over your head because one day those things will make sense to you, but they don't today. But he's going to communicate to you. This is his incarnation. He takes the man's ears and he takes the man's tongue because he took a very man's flesh. He's communicating with the man, vulnerable, eye to eye. Maybe with just the they, maybe they came aside too, and just the disciples, just to see the strange compassion of Jesus. But what's up with the spit, right? Why did Jesus have to spit on his hands? Well, here again, Jesus is communicating to the man in a way in which he can understand. Decapolis was a primarily Gentile, Greco-Roman culture. And one of the things of that culture is in Greco-Roman cultures, power was in the bodily fluids. So if you wanted to transfer power from one person to another, it would take a kind of bodily fluid to do that. Saliva in the powerful of the day, their saliva was also powerful. It's the same idea of when Jesus is going through the crowd and the woman comes and holds and touches his jacket, touches his robe. It's the same idea that from a great man, the things that great man touches is also greatness. So when Jesus spits on his fingers, he's communicating to this man in a way that which he can understand, which is a way to say, I'm the true power here. I'm the true powerful one. It comes from me. You're not going to find this anywhere else. Jesus is making a statement about himself when he spits on his fingers and says, Man, we seek the power from so many places and so many people, but the real power is right here. I'm the one in which real power, real change, real transformation comes. So Jesus is communicating again in the symbols of this man's belief systems, how Jesus is the actual fulfillment of the things that we hope for, but we are searching for in places that we'll never find. So he spits on it because the power of the saliva as a representation. Jesus is communicating to a man. How could you communicate to a deaf man that you were the ultimate power if you couldn't say anything? You would spit on your fingers. What a weird, strange compassion that Jesus has. But that's not it. Then it just gets weirder after that. Look at in verse 34. And looking up to heaven, he sighed. Circle that. He sighs. Like what? Like he's bored? He sighs. What does that even? So not only does Jesus do these strange things in his prayer, he sighs audibly. Mark points it out for us as it's a thing that was dramatic. It was meant to be noticed. Jesus isn't just like kind of just breathing. It's like in fact, the word is to groan. When he sighs, it's not sighing in boredom. It's not sighing in frustration. It's sighing in heartache. It's sighing with the man in his brokenness. It's groaning. He's groaning with the man. And there's something biblical here. Again, how would you declare to a man, and Jesus hasn't even healed him yet, and he's declaring to this man before he heals him who Christ is, but he has to do it without words. And so what he's doing is he's making this connection for us on this groaning. Jesus groans, right? Which is Acts chapter 7, verse 34. We get the sense that this man was probably Jewish because there was no tension between Jesus touching him, and they asked Jesus to touch him right away, which if he was Gentile, they probably wouldn't have asked that. They would have asked something else. So we assume that the man was probably a Gentile, actually, which means he would know conceptually the story of what God had done in the Old Testament. And Acts 7 gives us this little statement about God saving the Jewish people out of Egypt. He says, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I've heard their groaning, and I've come down to deliver them. Jesus groans and then delivers the man. God has heard the groaning. Jesus is groaning for us to bring deliverance. He's groaning on behalf of us. And he's groaning for the sake of this man. He's acknowledging the effect of sin and the fall and shame and hardship and disease and accidents and physical maladies. He's acknowledging the fallenness of the world. And here he's putting himself in not listening for the one to be delivered. He is the one who will be the deliverer and deliver us from our sin. Listen to Romans chapter 8, 26. This comes as a Christian too. You might know this verse. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. It's a different word for groaning, but it's a synonym. Jesus groans deeply in a way in which this man can never understand, but groans so that this man will understand. Here's an example. Beethoven went deaf. He wasn't born deaf, he went deaf. And after he went deaf, what did he do? He sawed the legs off his piano, put the piano on the ground so that he could feel the notes. If you were trying to communicate to a man that Jesus is with them, he loves them, that he's going to deliver them, that he is worth trusting and having hope in, Jesus would want the man to feel his compassion. So he sighs as a way for the man to feel the vibration of the fallenness of the world that Christ feels and that Christ has come to change. So then look what happens, because it only gets more surprising in the next couple verses. So then what happens? Verse 35, and his ears were opened. His tongue was released. You see, that's different than he could just speak now. His tongue was released from whatever was keeping him from being able to speak. And he spoke plainly. 36, and Jesus charged them to tell no one, but the more he charged them, the more zealous they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Now, I want you to see we're back to the they. You see that the man, Jesus speaks to him, and his ears were opened, but do you see it immediately goes right back to the they? Jesus charged them. They proclaimed. They were astonished. See, we would look at this and go, you know what? The crescendo of this little text is the man is healed and is able to speak, but that's not actually true. The crescendo of this text, the very apex of this story, comes in the phrase, he does all things well. That's a confession, a proclamation that these people make. Look at, and they were astonished beyond measure. They came, asked Jesus for a blessing. What they ended up getting was a healing. That's what I mean by their motivations were mixed motivations. It may have not been in true faith. They may not have known what Jesus could actually do. Jesus does way more than they could ever imagine. They want a blessing. Jesus changes their life. They're astonished. They're beyond measure. And then it crescendos at this proclamation because it's about Jesus. It's never about the man. And miracles are never about the miracles, and they're never about us. They're a means for us to see something so much better and so much bigger than we are. And so the crescendo isn't, look at this man who can talk now and hear now. Let's go watch a movie. Let's go have a conversation. No. Their eyes are on Jesus. And the crescendo confession is, he does all things well. He does it all well. What does that even mean? Well, like I'm a baseball fan, and the Angels, we have Ohtani. You might have heard a little bit of Ohtani. He pitches, he hits, he fields, he does it all. He's getting Babe Ruth numbers, and is probably going to go down as one of the greatest baseball players ever. When we say Ohtani does everything well, it's because he can play at a major league level in every position they put him in. Exceptional pitcher, fielder, hitter, right? The whole thing. When they're saying Jesus does all things well, they're saying that Jesus is able to accomplish everything good in every way and in every circumstance. See, Mark is saying that the man's ears and mouth was open. But the real miracle was that they now hear and can now speak of things that they would have never been able to hear or speak of before. The real miracle is that their eyes and their heart was open. The real miracle is they saw Jesus for who he was. And the real miracle is to come to a point where they can confess Jesus does everything well. And then look how it ends. And I'll show you, and we'll end here. I'll show you, he says, he has done all things well. He even makes deaf hear and the mute speak. Now, you might look at that, but there's something really amazing going on here. One, he says the word mute, which this word only shows up in two places, and it's here in Mark. It shows up nowhere else in the New Testament. And in the Septuagint, it shows up in Isaiah chapter 35. We're going to get there. But notice that Mark uses the word mute here and not speech impediment, because he's trying to make a much bigger point about who Jesus is and that he's doing everything well. And so he's bringing us back to a much bigger picture of Christ than just our own needs for miracles. Isaiah 35, 1 through 6. I'll show you how Mark is making this connection. Isaiah 35, 1 through 6. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon.
They shall see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Strengthen the weak hands. Make firm feeble knees. Say to those who have an anxious heart, be strong and fear not. Behold, your God will come with a vengeance, with the recompense of God. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute, that's the only other time that that word appears in the Bible, sing for joy. For waters break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. So when Jesus heals this man, he's going, look at what I'm doing. And their eyes are being blown away. Jesus does all things well. What does he do? He's bringing water. He's bringing water in a desert. He's freeing the tongue to sing in joy we've never been able to do in our own strength before. Water is breaking forth. The nature is being set right. The anxious heart is being settled. The wilderness is blooming abundantly with joy and singing. Weakness is being made strong. It's also on Isaiah 32, 1-4. Listen to this. Behold, the king will reign in righteousness. Princes will rule in justice. Each will be like a hiding place from the wind, a shelter from the storm, like streams of water in a dry place, like the shade of a great rock in a weary land. Then the eyes of those who will see will not be closed, and the ears of those who hear will give attention. The heart of the hasty will understand and know, and the tongue of the stammers will hasten to speak distinctly. The point is that Jesus does everything well by bringing all of our chaos to order once again. Great example of this, back to Beethoven. Beethoven said once that music is like a dream that I cannot hear. And in his very last words, it's been said that the very last thing that Beethoven said was, I will hear in heaven. Conductor Daniel Barenboim, who wrote on Beethoven, describes Beethoven like this. Beethoven's music tends to move from chaos to order, as if order were an imperative of human existence. Imperative means command. Beethoven's music embodied his understanding that right now music is like a dream, but one day that dream is going to be fulfilled. He'll hear as if he's never heard before. And in his music, he communicated from chaos to order as if it was the very command of our existence. I have a buddy, I just found out today, his 17-year-old son was diagnosed with leukemia today. He wrote, "Yesterday our loving God confused us. God is good and kind, and we are confused." See, a heart that believes in Jesus says, I'm confused, how dare God? But a heart that trusts in Jesus knows this. It's confusing. I don't know why God does what he does, but I know he's bringing all chaos to order. I know, just like Beethoven's music, it is the imperative of Christ and then the imperative of the Christian, of our very existence, to bring chaos to order. And how can we trust Christ in our chaos and know that he'll bring it to order? Because Christ went from order to the chaos of death in the cross. Have you been believing in Jesus but not trust him? Today's a new day. Christ is calling you. Do you know whether or not you have belief or trust? And here's what I would say. I would say what you do after you say the very Christian words, God's doing something good here. Christ does all things well. What you do after that determines whether or not that's just a statement of belief or a statement of trust. Maybe it'll take some time for your heart to get there, but after you say Jesus does all things well, do you despair like everybody else? Do you run away like everybody else? Do you run towards sin and false saviors like everybody else? Do you try to hide the pain or get rid of the discomfort through substances, people, relationships, or entertainment? When you say the words, Jesus does all things well, what do you do after that? That's the difference between, do you just believe, or are you growing in trust that in fact Christ does all things well?